Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, in the past, if you've been watching this show, you know that we believe that there is a connection between abortion and breast cancer. And we have today someone who's driven up from New Hamburg, New York, to talk about it. Let me give you first a little bit of background of who he is, and then why we're doing the show today. And it really has to do with some studies that were done in communist China regarding the abortion breast cancer link. Our guest today was born and raised in New York City. He graduated from Yale University in 1971 with a degree in biology. He then matriculated at NYU, where he was conferred a degree in biochemistry in 1981. He has been a professor at Baruch College of the City University of New York for 28 years, teaching biology and endocrinology, which is the study of hormones. Currently, he resides blissfully with his beautiful wife in the Poughkeepsie area and has 4 grown children. Well, welcome, Dr. Joel Brend.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, Dr. Brend, last month I saw an article that came out in the National Right to Life News that talked about the Chinese abortion breast cancer bombshell. Could you tell us what that was all about and maybe a little bit of background on the abortion breast cancer
Yes,
link?
it was in November, actually, just this past November, in an international cancer journal, well-known journal, peer-reviewed journal, Cancer Causes and Control, and it was what's called a meta-analysis, which was the sort of study that I published back in 1996, which pools the results of many different studies. And they actually pooled the results of 36 different studies going back over the last 20 years almost in communist China, and found that there was a significant link reported overall. That is to say, women who have abortions have a greater risk of breast cancer than women who don't.
I see. Now, you had done a meta-analysis, but it was from studies all over the world. I remember you said the first one was in Japan many years ago.
Yes, the very first study in a peer-reviewed journal, at least that I'm aware of, was published in 1957. So this has been around a long time. It's been found in women all over the world, every color, every nationality, every place that you look for it, you find that abortion increases the risk of breast cancer. And the study that we did was, of every study that had been published at the time, there were 23 studies from around the world as of 1996. What's interesting about this study is that it reproduces essentially the results that we found, that there is an increased risk. In this case, they found averaging about 44%. We found about a 30% on average increased risk. But this was on a completely different population of women, all from China, more recent cohorts of women. So you have something that is really important in validating scientific research, and that's reproducibility. So now we have the 23 studies that we reviewed in '96 and another 36 studies. We're talking about almost 60 studies now from around the world, spanning a time frame going back over half a century, and it still keeps showing the same thing. Women who have abortions have a greater risk of breast cancer than women who don't.
And I noticed that they were taking, a lot of times you were criticized in certain areas as far as the study is concerned. Like, for instance, they say, well, the population, women who don't have breast cancer aren't going to report that they've had an abortion, whereas women who have breast cancer, they'll say that they have an abortion.
Yes, this is...
What is that? Is that a bias of some sort?
Yeah, this is what's called the response bias or the reporting bias argument. And by bias in this case, they mean some difference between the women who have breast cancer and the women who don't have breast cancer to whom they're being compared, which is not due to what you're looking for, whether or not they had an abortion, but to some other difference that's introduced in the course of doing the study. And in this case, reporting bias or response bias means that if you are doing a study where you're asking women after the fact, you collect a number of breast cancer patients and a number of controls, and anyone who had abortions would be a number of years ago, and then you ask them about their reproductive history and to fill out a structured questionnaire and so on. The theory goes that women who have had abortions are going to be more honest about it if they have breast cancer, whereas they're going to be more likely to underreport or to lie about their reproductive history if they don't have breast cancer. Now that's a reasonable hypothesis that has to be tested, and the fact is it's been tested many times and found not to be the case in abortion breast cancer research. It's been disproven over and over and over again, and yet since saying anything negative about abortion is politically incorrect, the mainstream purveyors of public health information are grasping at straws. And so they say, well, you know, a relative risk of 1.5 or 1.3, a 30 or 50% increase in the risk of breast cancer, maybe it's just bias and it's not a real result. Well, in this case, we have studies in China where they argued that in China there is really no stigma against, about having an abortion. So many women have abortions that there's really no reason to believe that they would be hiding their reproductive history.
And
yet
that's because of the one-child policy.
One-child policy. I mean, it's not up to a woman deciding that she's going to have an abortion, basically. It's imposed by the government. So it is, in fact, the mainstream researchers that have argued that in China you don't have this problem. And, of course, they're fine with that as long as their study doesn't show a link. But if the study does show a link, all of a sudden there's this bias going on. And so this is clearly not the case, not only because it's that the Chinese population would not be expected to show this reporting bias, but also because it's been, as I said, disproved many times. In fact, in upstate New York, there was a study published in 1989 in the International Journal of Epidemiology, which showed a 90% increase in the risk of getting breast cancer among women who had an abortion, and that study was based on medical records. No bias in terms of what a woman remembered about her having an abortion or not, or was willing to tell about her history of having an abortion or not. So as I say, there have been a number of studies that have disproved this notion, yet it still persists, kind of like like Freddy keeps coming back and back to life, but even though the argument has been disproved. Now what's even more interesting in terms of that argument and putting that false argument to rest are studies that have come out of the subcontinent. Also in the last few months, in India and Bangladesh have come 3 more studies on abortion and breast cancer, or general studies on breast cancer identifying which factors are the risk factors. And they found that abortion was a risk factor for breast cancer. But what was really interesting is that instead of being a 30 or 50% increased risk, the 2 studies in India found 400% and 500% increased risks. And the study in Bangladesh found almost a 2,000% increased risk.
Now, is that because women are much younger when they have their first child?
Well, yes. To explain that a little bit, to flesh it out, the reason why the increased risk is so much is because the baseline risk of breast cancer is so small. Especially in a place like Bangladesh, breast cancer is rare. Why? Almost all the women get married when they're teenagers. They start having children when they're young. They breastfeed all of them. They don't drink alcohol. There are practically no other risk factors around to cause breast cancer except abortion. So it shows up as a very, very big number. And what's interesting about that in India and Bangladesh is that when you have such big numbers, for example, in the most recent study in India, which was just published on Christmas Eve in the Indian Journal of Cancer, they showed that when they compared the breast cancer patients to the healthy control women, they found out that 61% of the breast cancer patients, a majority of them, had actually had an abortion or more. Among the women who did not have breast cancer, only 16% had had abortions. Only 1 in 6 had had abortions. So the numbers are so lopsided that any of these subtle forms of bias that you might hypothesize could color the results a little bit this way or that way are just totally blown out of the water. I mean, this is overwhelming. These are the kinds of risks that were identified between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer over the years. 10-fold, 20-fold increased risk, no question about it.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about what they call the dose effect? What is that?
Oh, a dose effect means if you're testing any variable, any exposure that you suspect is increasing the risk of of getting any disease, like abortion and breast cancer, then if that's true, if it's really actually contributing to the cause of the disease and not just a happenstance association, then if you have one abortion, that increases risk. If you have 2 abortions, it should increase the risk more. If you have 3 abortions, it should increase the risk more than that. And they found that in the Chinese meta-analysis, that women who had 2 abortions had a greater risk than women who had 1 and had 3 abortions or more had a greater risk than those who had 2. So that's a dose effect, and that's one of the things that is looked for in epidemiological research, to infer that there really is a causative role being played by the variable or the exposure that you're actually looking at.
And for our audience, could you tell us what hormone are we talking about that would be the catalyst for all this breast cancer?
Well, the common denominator in breast cancer research is the main female hormone estrogen, some form of estrogen. So most risk factors are due to there being some kind of identifiable excess exposure to estrogen.
And while a woman is pregnant, does she have more estrogen flowing through her body?
It goes through the roof. I mean, this is when estrogen really, really goes sky high. It goes up 2,000% by the end of the first trimester. Well, you might say, well, why doesn't having a child increase the risk of breast cancer even more than never having been pregnant at all? And the reason has to do with breast physiology and breast development. We all think typically that the breasts develop when a girl goes through puberty, and the body of a girl turns into the body of a woman, and she grows breasts of adult size. But in fact, they don't really develop, they pretty much just grow. In order to develop the breasts into organs that can produce milk, you need to go through about 32 weeks of a full-term pregnancy. So we're talking about well into the 3rd trimester. And if the pregnancy is interrupted before 32 weeks, either by an abortion or by a live birth, a very premature live birth before 32 weeks, you get an increased risk of breast cancer, because those growing cells in the breast, comprising what we call type 1 and type 2 lobules, have just grown and grown and grown through most of the pregnancy. And so you end up with more places where cancers can start. Breast cancers only start in type 1 and type 2 lobules. Once you get to the last 8 weeks of a full-term pregnancy, then you get what are called type 3 and 4 lobules, the tissues in the breast which can actually produce milk. And once they're at that stage, they can no longer multiply. And so you can even cause mutations with carcinogens in type 3 and 4 lobules. It doesn't matter, because they will never become cancerous, because in order to become cancerous, a cell has to be able to multiply. We all know that cancer is a disease where cells are multiplying out of control. So once the breasts mature after a full-term pregnancy, the risk of breast cancer is actually lower, even though there was all of that estrogen and progesterone, but the main hormone for the growth is estrogen. Even though there was so much of it causing all that growth, the effect is reversed by causing all those extra cells to become matured into milk-producing cells. So that's why full-term pregnancy lowers a woman's risk of breast cancer. Delaying full-term pregnancy for any number of years or forever increases the risk of breast cancer. And so so if you have an abortion, you've not only delayed that first pregnancy or delayed that full-term pregnancy, and you don't get the reduction in risk that the pregnancy would have provided, but you've also experienced all this growth in the breast, producing more places for cancer to start than were there before you got pregnant in the first place. So you get this double effect of the risk of the effect of abortion, a double effect in terms of increasing breast cancer risk.
Let me ask you, in that case of estrogens, most abortions happen between 8 and 13 weeks, I'll say. Say if you were to have the abortion at 8 weeks, is your exposure less or greater than if you were to have an abortion at 12 weeks?
Well, it's the later the pregnancy goes, the longer the pregnancy goes, the greater the risk. For example, the easiest way to find a dose effect in the question of abortion and breast cancer is to look at gestational age. So when we did our meta-analysis, for example, back in 1996, there wasn't really a clear dose effect. Why? Because Some women got abortions at 6 months. Some women got abortion at 6 weeks. If you have 3 abortions at 6 weeks, it's probably about the same effect as having 1 abortion at 18 and 20 weeks. So it's hard to figure. So a group in Denmark did some very careful research in Denmark, which is they got a socialized medicine database, computerized with everybody's health records, pregnancy records, and if they have a pregnancy, when did it end, how did it end, what was the gestational age, all of that sort of thing. And when they compiled the data, they found that if you had a pregnancy that ended after 12 weeks, they had like about a 35% increase in the risk of breast cancer. If the pregnancy ended at the end of 18 weeks or more, it was an 89%, almost double the risk of breast cancer. So you could see that the risk goes up. And what was interesting about that study also is the same group did another study on the same database in Denmark looking at premature births. And they found exactly the same numbers on premature live births. If the live birth occurred before 32 weeks, you got that same 89%, almost twofold increase in breast cancer that they found on women who had an abortion after 18 weeks. So it gets to the point where probably about 18 or 20 weeks, it's a maximum effect. And then until 32 weeks, so anytime up to 32 weeks, you still have that increased risk, which is important also. I mean, there are women who have, for example, who are diagnosed with cancer. Let's say they are diagnosed with breast cancer. A lot of times they're advised to have an abortion, which is a mistake because they're more likely to die of the breast cancer if they have an abortion than if they have a live birth. But even if they have a live birth, it should be that if they want to induce the delivery of the live born child early so that they can then aggressively treat the cancer, they should wait till at least 32 weeks. And not deliver, let's say, induced labor at 30 weeks or something like that, because then the woman has the effect of having a late-term abortion. Because if you're terminating the pregnancy, the hormonal effect on a woman's physiology is going to be the same, whether the baby lives or dies. That's a separate body. Talking about the mother's body, it's when is that otherwise normal pregnancy going to be terminated? One other thing that should be mentioned in terms of normal pregnancy versus, let's say, a pregnancy that is not normal and which aborts spontaneously, what we usually call a miscarriage. Those are not generally associated with increased risk of breast cancer because they usually happen 90% of the time. They happen in the first trimester, and they happen precisely because you don't get the normally high surge in estrogen and progesterone, which causes that growth spurt in the breast anyway. So that is not a matter of dispute. Everyone acknowledges that a spontaneous abortion does not increase the risk of breast cancer. Mm-hmm. But the denial is all about the effect of induced abortion, and it's pretty much undeniable, but that doesn't seem to stop people from denying it.
I see. Now, I know that various organizations have been trying to discredit you, including the National Cancer Institute and various journals and that sort of thing. When are we, with this overwhelming evidence of these studies that keep coming in, when are they going to start backing off, or when are they going to start realizing that, abortion can be a catalyst to breast cancer?
Well, all I can do is keep speaking the truth about it. What is ironic and frightening, really, is that in order to get the truth about this subject, where do you have to go? Journals from places like Communist China and Iran. That's where you find the studies that actually reveal the truth about this. But in American journals, it's all denied. Even when a study comes out that finds it, it's reported with a poison pill or editorial that says, well, don't believe it, it's really not certain, it's really probably not true, and this is what happens. And people should know also that it has to do a lot with government. When you say the National Cancer Institute, that conveys a lot of respect. The National Cancer Institute, as if it's some institute of wonderful, dedicated, people who are against cancer. Actually, the NCI is another one of those 3-letter federal government agencies, like the IRS and the NSA. That's the NCI, the National Cancer Institute. It is a division of HHS, the same people who bring us healthcare.gov, right? Same agency that gives us Obamacare, gives us that. And
spent $1 billion on a website
right,
that doesn't
work. Speaking of spending money, what the National Cancer Institute is a federal agency which is basically a cadre of politically motivated bureaucrats who decide what institution gets cancer research funds and which ones don't. So they basically, around the world, essentially, they have the money, the research money for the US and also much of the rest of the world in terms of cancer research. And so they pretty much have a say-so as to what causes cancer and what doesn't anywhere around the world. They are such a worldwide respected authority, but they are not worthy of that respect. In that case, in the case of politically sensitive issues such as abortion, they're just completely corrupt. And what do you say about a corrupt agency? When are they going to become uncorrupt?
Well, I mean,
tough question.
How many people are down there at NCI? Is it a handful of people that are the decision makers, say we're going to fund this project, that project? And
essentially, yeah, in each division I think it probably comes down to, I don't know if you'd say a handful, 10, 20, 30, however many. But these are people who apply for grants, and they have ongoing what are called program project grants or National Cancer Center grants or some sort of government grants, which often run into the millions of dollars over a multi-year term. Mm-hmm. And so if someone publishes papers which don't toe the party line, then they can lose their grants. They lose their grants, whole institutes can dry up. Whole wings, hundreds of people could lose their jobs. Everything down to the, to the bottle washer in the laboratory may be out of work because some bureaucrat in Washington decides that the scientists who write the papers and who are, on the byline of the grant applications aren't being politically correct enough in terms of acknowledging or reinforcing the safety of something that's supposed to be safe. It's really very simple. It's anything that's supposed to be safe, and the party line is that oral contraceptives, they call the pill. I mean, these are really infertility-inducing steroid drugs. That's what the pill is, but they give it that nice name. Infertility-inducing steroid drugs are given out like candy, and they're supposed to be safe. And the morning after pill is supposed to be safe, and abortion is supposed to be safe, and all these vaccinations are supposed to be safe, 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 safe. Well, if you want government money to do any research on these areas, you better say that they're safe. You better reinforce the party line. This is one of the problems with big government. And really, when people talk about advances made in cancer research and how so many cancers, which used to be certain death sentences, now you have people living essentially normal lives or close to it for years and even decades because of the wonders of modern medical research in terms of cancer. Most of those are based on drugs that were developed in drug company laboratories. I mean, everybody would love to give credit to the wonderful National Cancer Institute of the American Cancer Society for all the progress we've made in treating cancer. No, I can say safely because of their cover-up and their denial of the abortion breast cancer link, just to name one thing, that the National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society are responsible for giving more people cancer than for taking care of it, preventing it, or curing it. And that's a horrible thing to contemplate, but that's where we are today in our big government-sponsored state.
Wow, well, we just have a minute left, and so what pleases you most of all about these most recent studies?
Well, to the extent that I take pleasure in it, it's nice to get corroboration of one's earlier work. I mean, they not only reproduce the results that we found in our meta-analysis back in 1996, but they cited my own arguments in explaining what was happening and why, cited my research, cited a publication that I published in the British Journal of Cancer, for example, on abortion and breast cancer in China back in 2004. And these are people that I don't know, so this is corroboration, and that's, as a scientist, it's good to have your data reproduced and all that. However, as someone who basically cares about women's health, you're talking about, if you just look at India and China alone, you have over 1 billion women in India and China alone. If abortion increases their risk of breast cancer, adds, let's say, 2% lifetime risk, and half of those women, conservatively speaking, end up having one or more abortions during their lifetime. Mm-hmm. Well, you can very simply do the math. If you have 1 billion women, half of them with a 2% lifetime risk of breast cancer, you're talking about 10 million women.
Wow.
Getting breast cancer, and millions of women in India and China who are alive today in the cohort of women who are now of childbearing age, millions of them dying of breast cancer because they had an abortion. Now, the National Cancer Institute acknowledges that, yes, there's a problem, they say. They say that China is on the cusp of a breast cancer epidemic. Why? Well, changing reproductive patterns. They never use the word abortion. Unavoidable consequences of economic progress. All of these euphemisms that talk around the issue and never really get to it.
Well, Dr. Brin, that's an...
Welcome to the war on women.
Oh, wow.
The real war on women.
The real
this is
war
it.
on women. Well, folks, we hope you found today's show, unfortunately we've run out of time, but I hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life. Well, welcome, Paul Rondeau. Paul, what is it that you perceive? If it's not the economy, then what do you perceive as this upcoming election? What is really important, and is it a dire situation?
Well, let me just make this metaphor. If we all had more coin in our pockets, but bars on our windows, would we be more free or less free? And this election has been focusing on something extremely important. That is the economy, jobs, social justice. I understand all of that. But while we've all been focused on that, and the GOP has refused almost to talk about anything else, I can talk to you about multiple bills protecting the family, protecting the preborn that have come and gone, protecting targeted abortions against female babies have come and gone, never got to a vote because they felt it was a distraction on the economy, which they felt was a winning issue, and maybe it will be. But in the meantime, we have allowed, in many respects, our first freedoms, speech, religion.